Hi again, folks. Well, we've made it from cells past tissues, and now we are starting into our study of organ systems. Today, and actually this is part 2, called Support and Movement. Chapter 6 is the integumentary system. Wonder how many of you have never heard that term before. The skin is also known as the integument. Don't know who came up with that. Whereas the integumentary system consists of the skin and its accessory organs, if you will, the hair, nails, and cutaneous glands. These are glands whose ducts open up to the outside. There are 4 subheadings to this chapter. 6.1 is study of the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. 6.2 talks about the hair and nails. 6.3 are these cutaneous glands. And 6.4, rather short, talks about a couple of different skin disorders. Once again, please go to the study guide on page 199, and it's an excellent idea if you would print that off. 6.1, the skin and subcutaneous tissue. If someone had asked you this in a trivia bowl or something, I bet a lot of you would miss this. What is the body's largest and heaviest organ? It is the skin, believe it or not. In adults, this covers up to almost 2 square meters and accounts for almost 15% of our body weight. It consists of 2 layers that you can see in figure 6.1. It's an excellent picture if you can copy that. Good to study from. The squamous epithelium is called the epidermis, and that's the side to the outside, the layer to the outside, and the dermis, which is lower. Okay, the skin has several different functions, and I'm just going to go through them quickly. I leave it to you to go back and read a little bit more about them. First, obvious function is resistance to trauma and infection. The skin is our first line defense against infection. Makes sense? If we have a intact skin, most bacteria and viruses cannot penetrate that skin. There are other barrier functions. Number 2. Number 3 is vitamin D synthesis in the presence of sunshine. Number 4 is sensation, because it's in the skin where many of the nerve endings that supply heat, cold, touch, texture, etc., where they end. And the 5th is thermoregulation. Using our skin and the cutaneous glands, our bodies are able to maintain homeostasis of our skin. Now, the outer layer towards the external part of the body is called the epidermis. And from our study of tissue, if you go back and look at those photos, the epidermis is a keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Now, it's also interesting that this surface consists of all dead cells packed with a tough protein called keratin. The cells are 3 different types of cells in the epidermis, and you can see those also here in figure 6.3, page 179. The stem cells are the undifferentiated cells that can divide and turn into the other two types of cells. Secondly, are keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the great majority of the epithelial cells. And as their name implies, they synthesize keratin, a protein that's important to the structure. And third are the melanocytes. These synthesize brown to black, the black pigment. It's also called melanin. 4 are tactile cells, and 5 are dendritic cells. I guess I better look a little bit further when they start listing things. Tactile cells, as we discussed briefly, are where the nerve endings are that our brain can use to know what's going on at the periphery. Layers of the epidermis include the stratum basale, the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum. It would be a good idea had you studied Latin before you started into this. I will leave this to you also to study just a little bit more about them. I'm sure, well, not sure, I don't write the test, but this might come up if you have a photo or a sketch of the skin and you are told to identify one or more of the layers of the epidermis. Below the epidermis is the dermis, and it is much thicker in most places. In a microscope, you can see the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis. It is very conspicuous and is usually quite wavy. Okay. Skin color, briefly, comes mostly from this pigment melanin. People of African American descent, Cuban descent, and others have more of the melanin than a lot of people do, and they have a brownish or blackish skin tone. Ultraviolet light rays from sunshine can also stimulate the melanocytes to synthesize melanin. Some people tan quite nicely. A couple other things can lead to color in the skin. One is the hemoglobin that's present in our red blood cells, and that gives a reddish to pinkish hue because many of the very superficial blood vessels show through the skin. And another is keratin. It's a yellowish pigment that's acquired from egg yolks, yellow and orange vegetables. I remember during my family medicine days that not too infrequently I would see babies that were brought in by their mother wondering why their skin color seemed to be quite yellow or orangish. They were worried that it was something terrible. Well, no, I found out in questioning that they were giving the baby primarily yellow and orange vegetables. Now, there are a couple of other abnormal colors. Cyanosis, if there's not enough oxygen. Erythema is due to an abnormal redness of the skin. If there's sunburn, embarrassment, exercise, hot weather, etc. Pallor just means that there's very little blood flow or possibly due to anemia. It's a whitish color. Albinism is a genetic lack of melanin that causes a very milky white hair and skin and blue-gray eyes. This is a recessive gene that has to come from both parents. Jaundice is this yellowing of the skin that I mentioned and the whites of the eyes. And it is due primarily to problems in the liver and the buildup of bilirubin. This is potentially a very, very serious problem. There are several types of skin markings that we'll just talk about briefly. They're called friction ridges. Are the markings on the fingertips that give us our fingerprints. You can't really see these ridges except through a microscope. Flexion lines are lines in the skin on the flexor surfaces of the body. If you bend your fingers, if you bend your arm, you will see these lines. Got a cat wandering across here. Freckles, moles, hemangiomas, birthmarks are also commonly called hemangiomas. Patches of skin that are discolored by very benign tumors of blood capillaries. 6.2, very brief discussion, slow down, of the hair and the nails. The hair, nails, and cutaneous glands, as I mentioned, are called accessory organs or appendages of the skin. The hair and nails are composed primarily of dead, keratinized cells. Figure 6.7 shows a artist's sketch and then a microscopic photo of a hair starting low with the hair follicle on up and out of the surface of the skin. I'll leave most of this to you just to sort through. The basic three parts of the hair you should know. The bulb is a swelling at the base of the hair where the hair originates. And the root is the remainder of the hair that's within the follicle. And then the shaft is the part of the hair that actually shows above the skin surface. And then there's some discussion there about hair color, hair loss, hair growth that I won't go into very much detail about. You might wonder why we even have hair. We don't need some of it, but occasionally our body hair, if we have a lot of it, is able to help conserve heat. The hair on top of our heads is good in cold weather to help keep heat in. Also, fingernails, page 190. Well, I shouldn't say fingernails and toenail. Figure 6.10, slow down, shows the anatomy of a typical fingernail. The part that we can see from the outside is called the nail body, and it is growing out of the nail root that is actually under the cuticle at the base of the nail. The only function that I know of fingernails, it does allow us to pick up things easier. But as far as I can tell, the primary function is to grow and give us something to do when we have to clean out the fingernails and clip them. I think we would all, sometimes I'd just as soon I didn't have any nails whatsoever. There's a real serious and painful problem that can happen in the toes when you have an ingrown toenail. I did many cases of surgery to remove this problem with ingrown toenails. 6.3 and the figure 6.11 show cutaneous glands. Cutaneous refers to the skin. There are 5 kinds of cutaneous glands, but they are 2 of them are sweat glands, one sebaceous gland, one ceruminous gland, and finally mammary glands. Sweat glands release sweat, if you will, to the surface of the skin, and that does allow us to maintain homeostasis of our internal heat. If it's too hot and we sweat, when that sweat evaporates, it removes heat from the surface of the body. Sebaceous glands produce an oily secretion called sebum. And the sebum actually keeps our skin and our hair from becoming dry, brittle, and cracked. It helps us maintain the skin as an undamaged, so that it is protecting us. The ceruminous glands are found only in the external ear canal. Their secretions are called earwax or cerumen. And its purpose is not just to plug up the ear so you can't hear, but it is to trap foreign bodies from going on inside and carry away dead epithelial cells. Of course, then we have the mammary glands that are breasts. Both male and females have mammary glands, but the milk-producing glands only develop in the female breast during pregnancy and lactation. You might be interested to know that I had a patient, only one that I can remember, possibly 2, a senior fellow in his 80s who actually died from metastatic breast cancer. It's very, very rare in men, but it can happen. Finally, just a little discussion of skin disorders. One of the major types of cancer that occurs in the United States is skin cancer. Your author says it occurs in about 1 out of 5 people. There are 3 major types of skin cancer. There are pictures, very typical pictures on page 194. Basal cell cancers are most commonly on the head. Squamous cell cancers can occur most anywhere else. And that horrible, ugly-looking thing at the bottom in figure C is a melanoma, also called a malignant melanoma. It fortunately accounts for no more than 5% of skin cancers, but it is extremely aggressive and still kills many people in this country every year. Again, during my days in practice, I removed hundreds to thousands of basal cell cancers and squamous cell cancers. Can do that with a local anesthesia and either a needle, electric needle, or a scalpel with cauterization afterwards. They're very superficial and easy to remove. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about burns. I'm sure that each and every one of you has at some point suffered a burn to the skin. And these can be very annoying and painful, such as a first-degree burn that you'd get from touching something hot or from sunburn. If you look at figure 6.13 on page 195, the skin, the sunburn or the first-degree burn is only of the epidermis. It's very red, warm, and painful to touch. A second degree penetrates the epidermis and into the epidermis. This is called a partial thickness burn. One of the hallmarks of it is a blistering, and you can see that in this young person whose picture is in figure B. When I would see that type of a burn when I was working in the emergency room, unless the family could really give me a good explanation of how that happened, I would tend to suspect child abuse, especially if the child were younger. Sometimes it's horrible to think of, but mothers and fathers might try to punish their child by holding them and dunking them in scalding water. Fortunately, this is an absolutely mandatory of all people in the emergency, all professionals in the emergency room, to report this to the police. Finally, there are third-degree burns that you picture, part C. These penetrate all the way through the dermis and epidermis. They're called full-thickness burns, and some even go deeper into the muscle and bone. These, depending on how much of the body they cover, can cause death. It's probably not a good place to end, but I'm going to end my discussion here of Chapter 6. Thank you for your attention.